Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Flisher. Hey, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. This is a show about astrology, and today I'm going to continue my discussion about the houses. Remember I mentioned to you the last couple of episodes about the houses. We did houses 1 through 3 the first time, 4 through 6 the second time, and today we're going to do 7, 8, and 9, and then another one I'll do 9, 10, 11, 12. We'll get them all covered. The reason we're doing it this way is because it's easier to break them into smaller doses like this. The houses in astrology are where the action takes place. When you people read when I write my reports for you every week in my newsletter, which you can get at turningthewheel.com or chrisflisher.com, I will use the houses as a method to show you where the action is happening in your life. The reason this works on a universal level is because we set the chart for the sign of the chart of the person, or all Aries, or all Tauruses, or all Geminis, or all Cancers, and so on. Set it on the ascendant, meaning that's the rising sign, and then I can see where the action is going to be taking place in the chart, and I know that all Aries are going to be going through a certain quality or certain characteristic that week coming up. All Taurus will be going through something, and so on. This is how we understand, how we come to use astrology to be a predictive tool, because it does work. It's very predictive. People stop me all the time and say, wow, you got my horoscope just right last week. It was perfect. And that's not so much a talent of me. Yes, I know how to read the charts, so that's good. But the greater story comes from the accuracy that astrology can bring to us and to our understanding. I'll do a quick review just to go through this very quickly so you understand. This is the chart of an anonymous person, John Doe. April 1st, you can see his birth time is 4:31 p.m., Meriden, Connecticut. And your chart is going to look very different than this unless you were born at the exact same time and place. Unless you're this guy's twin, your chart's going to look different. It's going to have a different set of planets in different places. All of it's going to be different. What's unique about it is that it is unique to each individual. The birth chart forms what I call a fingerprint, or it's a snapshot of your DNA, and it is incredibly accurate, and it will always stay with you all the time. As you see right here on the screen, this is a static chart. This is never going to change. This is this person's chart based on this time and date up here, right here. But those are the most important pieces to understand. So, as that is a backdrop, it's important to understand that your chart will be different. So, when you're looking at other people's charts and you're trying to find out who's compatible with you and who's not compatible with you, you would begin to see you'd find commonality based on elements or on signs. And that's what you'd find. And so you would want to be with somebody who's the right sign for you, obviously. You go back over your life, you look at your relationships, and those that you were best, those who you were fondest of, or those that you married or fell in love with, there's probably a very good reason for that. And it has to do with astrology and the concreteness of it and the complexity of it. When you understand how to read them and interpret the charts, it's easy to see where people will jive and where they won't jive. And it's a remarkably predictive tool. Not only that, but this is, I said, this is a static chart. As we get into a further episode down the road, I'll show you a static and a dynamic chart where there's two charts together. That's how we can tell the action. But I'll get into that later down the road. I don't want to get you confused when we're talking about the houses. So the houses are pieces of the pie. There's 12 houses in the astrology wheel. It starts out with 1 here, 2, you can see the numbers right there, all the way around to 12. And it's run in a counterclockwise fashion. That's very important. So in the past 2 episodes, I went through the houses 1 through 3, and then we did 4, 5, and 6, and now we're going to talk about 7, 8, and 9. Now, and the reason these are interesting houses, every one of these are important. What's interesting about, in particular, the 1st, the 4th, the 7th, and the 10th houses, those are the basic cardinal houses. And in this case, the 7th house, being the 7th from the beginning of Aries, is the house ruled by Libra. Libra is a sign that espouses and exemplifies balance and harmony. So we always have this balancing act, which is good. So the symbol for it is the scales, the blind justice holding the scales of justice, so that we get balance. Libra is balance. That's the 7th house is ruled by Libra. And it's the house of, guess what? Relationships. Now, What could be more appropriate? This is why astrology is so incredibly accurate. We know that relationships are an incredible part. We are in a relationship with everything and everybody all the time, whether it be our spouse, whether it be our children, whether it be our plumber, whether it be the guy who plows your driveway. We are in a relationship with everybody, everything, your boss at work, your friends. Everything is related to a relationship and how you relate to that. That's why the 7th house is so incredibly important. This particular person has, you can see, that circle up there with the 12 next to it, that is 12 degrees Aries. That is the sign of that individual, and that individual has the sun in his 7th house, meaning that relationships are more important for him than anything else in the world right now. That's an overstatement for a reason, because this is a person who lives, breathes, and thrives on relating to others. It is through the act of conversing with another person that this person receives their drive and their motivation and their inspiration comes from other people. That's not to say that other people put ideas in his head or her head, whatever the person may be. It means that they are stimulated by the interaction of other people. The other person will say something, they'll get something back. So it's a reciprocal kind of information, a kind of conversation and arrangement and relationship. But relationship is very, very important. We've all got close friends. That's a close relationship. Your relationship wouldn't have developed as a close friend had the relationship not been right. In your case, if you have somebody who's very close to you, your oldest friend, you're connected to each other because there's a compatibility there, there's a shared mutual interest, there's a certain passion, same values, same sort of modus operandi, you have the same sort of drives and desires. These are the things that cement relationships together, and they are very, very, very useful. And the reason I bring the book in for this particular case is because each house has 300 or 400 different attributes that you can assign to it. Now, I know that's daunting for anybody trying to learn astrology, but what I can tell you is that the best way to do it is to boil it down into simple words that allow you to remember what the 7th house is about. And this is sort of an intellectual exercise that you can do. When you think of relationships, it is you as an individual looking out at the world and your relationship with everything that goes on. You may be a father, you may be a mother, you're an uncle, you're a cousin, you're a brother, you're a sister, you're a friend, you're a lover. The list goes on and on. Friend, next door neighbor. We all have this long list of titles that we can associate to ourselves. And as we age, of course, we get more. Sooner or later, we become grandparents, we become uncles, we become, divorcees, we become newlyweds. All these things are titles. Each of those signifies a relationship, and that is what's important about this case. So when it gets to the 7th house, I'm going to read some ideas off to you. Now, we all know that relationships are the primary thing, but it also has to do with close friends, close personal friends, business partners, children, in some cases, the second child more often than not, at least in a man's horoscope is typically the case. Clients are relationships. If you're a doctor or a lawyer or something like that, you've got clients. Clients are a part of your relationship. That is who you are involved with. As I mentioned, aunts, uncles, and it also has to do with arbitrations and arguments with the public. So if you were in a legal battle for some reason, you'd find a lot of activity happening in your 7th house because you are in a situation where you're trying to resolve a problem with a larger entity. So that's your relationship to that entity. Any sort of legal arrangement with a large entity, like a lawsuit against a car manufacturer, say, for example, or a lawsuit against a bank, or a bank's lawsuit against you, those are ruled by the 7th house. And I say that, you'd say, when I ran the dynamic chart that I mentioned earlier, if I put that on top of this, you'd see exactly where the action was happening. You'd say, wow, that is so accurate. And that's why astrology does absolutely work. It's phenomenal. So I mentioned also the titles of names that we could be. I mentioned, divorce is also part of the 7th house because it's the opposite. It's the dissolution of the relationship. And one important point is that the 7th house here is directly across from the 1st house. Now, don't mind the lines in between. I'll get to that in another segment. But the lines here, the fact that the 7th house is directly opposite the 1st house is critical point because the 1st house is the house of self. That is the individual. That is who we are as an individual. We are this person. And when we enter into a relationship, we sort of change that dynamic. We become different people when we enter into a relationship, regardless of what that may be. You're not the same with your wife or your husband as you are with your boss. Hopefully, maybe you are. I don't know. But anyway, you get the point. And you're not the same with your daughter or son as you would be with, you're not the same with your daughter as you would be with your son, for example, and vice versa. So each relationship has its own set of markers and details. And in that respect, the relationship becomes a composite of two entities. So we have an A function and a B function. You put them together to form a relationship, and we get AB. That's the sort of the combination we would get. Or some people would also say that it's C in that mathematical terminology because of the fact that it brings into account a third element. Because we do become a third element. A couple, John and Jane, are different as a couple to the outside world than John is by himself or Jane is by herself. See how that works? Okay. Other things, friends in foreign countries, mates, marriage, lawsuits, as I mentioned, international dispute, husbands, cousins, aunts, uncles, death of secret enemies is an interesting one, I thought. Girlfriends, grandchildren, all of these things, matrimony, all these things fall under the auspices of the seventh house. Partners, partnerships, business alliances. Now we'll see some of this later on as we get into the 11th house. That's where business assignments come into play. But for the most part, it absolutely works, completely the case. Vacations. But the one thing I would say, if you have to adhere to one word for relationships, for the seventh house rather, I would just remember Libra is the sign that rules it. And relationships are the aspect that we are going to most see in that house. So whenever you have something happening in your seventh house or in an angle of the seventh house, that's where you're going to find that aspect coming into account. So let's move on to the eighth house. The eighth house is a very interesting one. The eighth house is the next one up, as you can see right there. That is ruled by Scorpio. It's the house of regeneration. And when we use the word regeneration, the first two things I come to think of are sex and death, because one is regenerative and one is depletive. And so, but it is a change of that. And it is the house of sex and death, which makes it sound very spicy. But it really is about regeneration. It's where we find our spiritual grounding. It's where and the fact that it's ruled by Scorpio means that there's a certain intensity to it. Scorpio, as I've mentioned in the past, is a very intense, often secretive sign, unafraid to go into the depths of humanity and into the undercurrents. You know, I've known many Scorpio people who are crazy about, horror films and sort of the dark side of life, and they're fascinated by the occult and stuff like that. And now, granted, I'm making generalizations, but you understand my point. And the eighth house has, it's where we find religion and spirituality. We find a lot of that there. We find a sense of belief systems there. So some of the words that are very key, and the eighth house is typically about outside resources and outside money. It's also about elderly people, it's about outside money. So when you see that it's opposite the second house, as you see here, this is about our personal resources and personal wealth. Whereas we get to the eighth house up here, this is about wealth from other people. So it's the house of inheritances. It's the house of sex and death, as I said. Those are the two juiciest ones. But it's also about anything having to do with legal entities. So this is where you'd find the IRS. This is where you'd find the financial institutions. This is where you'd find insurance companies. This is where you'd find banking, for example. All of those bill collectors, large municipalities like town governments or universities are there. Often I'll see clients who have a very prominent position there, and they are involved in a large organization such as a university. And a university is an enormous self-involved organization that has all kinds of information going on inside and serves other people. So it's a large area of the thing. And we also have, as I mentioned, death is a big thing. Grandfathers, it rules the genitals, for example. Every one of these houses has a certain part of that. Maybe that's why the sex thing is involved. Anyway, but insurance companies, legacies, inheritance. So this is very important. Inheritance, alimony, accountants, all those big words come into effect. And it's interesting because mortgages are also there, mortality, Medicare, medical, losses, life insurance would be represented there. And the reason I mention this long line of adjectives is because they give you a sense of the theme that's going to be happening in that house. The theme. Now there's lots of other words that you can, as I said, there's pages and pages of things that you can use to apply. I'm just cherry picking for ease of use so you can understand them. But there is a overarching idea of where these things fall into place and how they work in your life. Foreign offices, like in other words, if you're involved in the foreign, say you're involved in the diplomacy corps or whatever. Morgues, money of the deceased, that's where your inheritance would come in. Medicare is one. Life after death is an interesting one. So people believe in life after death, rebirth. That's where you'd also find it. We'd come into that. Public income, heirlooms, honors of friends, any sort of honor that's, like you belong to something and you get supposing you belong to a society, you get recognized for your contribution, an organization, that would be an honorarium. That would fall into the eighth house because it's sort of being recognized in a larger entity. Outside, so venture capital is a large piece of what's in the 8th house, because that is outside money coming in to support the self over here. Outside money from the 8th house comes into the 2nd house to support the self. This is a very important piece of what makes the 8th house work. Other words that apply to it are very interesting words: evolution, excretion, financial relationship, foreign persons, friends, generation, government. All those words are big. Nephews, nieces, passion, obviously. Passion. If sex and death is there, you're going to have passion. Professions, psychism, psychics. Psychics, astrologers oftentimes have a strong 8th house component. Surgery, suicides, undertakers. So you can see there's a certain darkness there, obviously. That sort of applies to the Scorpio piece of the pie. But by the same token, we see this interaction with large entities. And so when you think about a large entity, there's a certain amount of distance between you and the entity. You don't go marching up to Liberty Mutual and knock on the door and have a conversation with Liberty Mutual. You have a conversation with somebody in there. So it's the relationship of that big entity to you. And in that case, that's where the 8th house comes in. Now, in this particular person's case, just as an aside, there's Mercury and Jupiter there. This person is probably highly interested in some sort of education of occult sciences, or perhaps witchcraft, or anything interesting to do with religion. Religion also falls in here. Religion is more the case of the 9th house. We'll get to that when we get there next. But there's also a strong component of religion, and because there's a certain depth. A person who is involved in the 8th house has to be able to go deep and be unafraid of going deep. Unafraid of going deep. That's why some of these things are important. Possessions of one's marriage or business partner. So if you were in a business partner and they died and they left you the business, that would be very much of an 8th house thing. Public income and money, regeneration, spiritual and mental, wealth of marriage or business partner wills, undertakers, of course, taxation, stepchildren and stepbrothers, because they come into the marriage through a relationship. So stepbrother or stepson would come to the relationship through somebody else. That's why it's important to have that combination there. Sons-in-laws, these are all major words. Slaughter and slaughterhouses. I know that sounds grisly, but this is also part of the 8th house, because the 8th house does deal with this topic of death. But like all of astrology, it is a paradox of opposing themes always. That's why we have all these characteristics do oppose each other. The 1st house is opposed by the 7th, the relationship house. The 2nd house is opposed by the 8th house. 3rd is opposed by the 9th house. There's a symbiotic relationship there where the opposite house also has a certain element of the same kind of theme, but in a different context, so that when they two work together, you can see that happening much more clearly. So that's the 8th house. People who have planets in the 8th house tend to be unafraid of the dark side, tend to be fascinated by it or intrigued by it, and easy to talk to about it, unafraid to go there, or may have a preponderance, in other words, a lot of this in their lives. People who have had perhaps a lot of death in their lives, and we all face that at some point in time. It's part of living, obviously. But some people have had it in an inordinate amount. If somebody lost their wife at a very young age, or lost a child, God forbid, all of those things would be signified by the 8th house, and this is why the 8th house is always feared. But that's also why it is sort of the Scorpio is sort of the overarching planet, overarching sign that rules it, because it makes sense. This is the sign, this is the house that rules all of those transgressions and those great milestones of life, the birth and the death. Those are two opposite ends of the spectrum. And one end is, the beginning, and one is the end. And some may argue that the death is the end, is a new beginning that leads to another end. And that may very well be. I'll tell you when I get there and I find out if that's the case, if I can get back to you somehow. If there's Bluetooth in heaven. Anyway, let's move on to the 9th house. The 9th house is the house located up here in the corner right there. It's the house ruled by Sagittarius. Sagittarius is the great wanderer, the great spiritual wanderer, the adventurer of the zodiac. And so this is the house, the 9th house, is the house of spirituality, travel, and education. And basically, it's all things that expand one's view of the world. So when we think about travel, when you travel, you're exposed to different cultures, you're exposed to different people, different ideas, different languages, different foods, different money. All kinds of things happen to you. When you have that experience, your mind becomes much broader. You're far more willing to accept that of other cultures. It's a great method and a great practice to become more tolerant of others. The more you travel, the more tolerant you're going to be of other people, because You've learned more about them. And the same is true for education. This is why I mentioned education. Education and travel are two of the best ways to spend money, in my opinion, in the world. Because in both cases, you're broadening your sense of who you are, your skill set. You're a much broader, deeper, more highly evolved individual as a result of having this combination. Now, this person has nothing in their 12th house and 9th house. Does that mean anything? No. It just means that they are willing to fill the house. Matter of fact, they may work hard to fill the house. The same way with the 5th house. This person might be a traveling artist for all we know. If you get my drift, because of the 12th house and the 9th house and the 5th house, both empty in this case. And don't forget, this is just a random chart, applies only to this person. Your chart is going to be significantly different and will have just as much granularity there. And if you come to see me, turningofthewheel.com, turningofthewheel.tv, or chrisflisher.com, any one of those websites, you can get a hold of me and email me. When you contact me and you ask for your chart or set up a reading with me, I can identify your chart and where the houses are in your particular chart, and you will see, oh my gosh, that's exactly how it is. By knowing where the things are, the planets are in the charts, these are symbols that identify the planets that are in the chart at the time of your birth, of this person's birth. That gives me an indication of the personality quirks that you have, the attributes and liabilities that are part of who you are. They're all there for show, and the astrology chart brings it clearly into sight. Everything coalesces there. You can see clearly where people are falling apart or where their strengths and weaknesses are. Now, the 9th house, as I said, is the house that is ruled by Sagittarius. Sagittarius is the great traveler. If you know any Sagittarians in your life, I'm sure they love to travel. I'm sure they love education. And these are all generalizations, don't forget, of course. But by the same token, they do allow you, and I said this is the idea, you want to be able to tease the idea, this intellectually, broaden this out, bring this out to a larger spectrum where you can say, okay, anything that broadens your mind or exposes you in some way will be a 9th house attribute, 9th house characteristic. So let's get into some of the things that we see there. Advertising, okay, that makes perfect sense. Big billboards, thinking outside of the box. Airlines, travel agents, aliens, ambassadors, all of which are travel. These are all people who spend their time travel. Cablegrams, this is written a long time ago. Cablegrams and telegrams used to be a very common form of communication. But nowadays we'd attribute that to text messages and iPhones, because that's about communication and travel. These are all fall into place. And long distance, countries in foreign countries, courts in foreign countries, Supreme Courts, devotion, education, as I mentioned. Education is a huge, especially yours or the educational facilities themselves. Ideals, ideas, sort of spirituality, truth, and justice. Those are all found there. They're also found in other houses, and so there is some overlap, but you want to get the idea of this general theme of expansion. The main word I want to get across to you is that the 9th house is all about expansion and the desire to expand through exposure to new things that you haven't seen before. That happens with travel, that happens with education, that happens also with spirituality. Interestingly enough, Pope Francis is a Sagittarian, which makes perfect sense. He's a spiritual traveler if ever there was one, right? Regardless of what's going on with him. So this is the same thing. So any sort of relationship with foreign countries is there. So we'd have things like passports would be part of the 7th house. Literature, because has to do with education. Any sort of class, any sort of educational class whatsoever, whatever it may be. Institutions of higher living and their personnel. International commerce, trade deals, NAFTA, TPP, these are all big trade deals. Those are very Sagittarian 9th house characteristics, 9th house sort of examples of what that would look like. Churches, clergymen, priests, rabbis, because they are all part of the religious spiritual realm. Courts of law in general, as I mentioned before. Devotion, dreams and dream consciousness, because dream allow you to escape. Education is a huge one, so that means, explorers is another one. Education and explorers are both big. Juries, knowledge and attainment of a degree, also ruled by that. If somebody had, say, when you'll get this later on, if somebody had something going through their 9th house and they were in college, it'd be a perfect opportunity to see that happening. Matter of fact, I was just doing that not too long ago, and I had Saturn in my 9th house, and my Saturn in my 9th house means I'm working hard to establish your education and to further myself and deepen my skill set. So it's very important in that regard. Philosophy is a big word for the 9th house as well. Philosophy, and the list goes on. Philanthropy, philosophy, places far from one's birth, preaching, prayers, The press, in some ways, it has a little bit to do with this simply because it's opposite the third house. The third house is, the third house is the list of writing and communication, so it makes sense. So publications are also part of that too. Very important piece of it. Radio and television are very part much of the ninth house because they are broadcasting outwardly all the time. So I want you to understand that these are all about the Supreme Court, teachers, teaching, college, theologians, transportation, traffic, long distance, universities, vocations, voyages, writers and writings of philosophic or spiritual texts. So again, this gives you an idea why this particular house is important, because it's directly across the third house. The third house is about correspondence, travel, and siblings. So, and primarily about correspondence. But when you're corresponding, you are also broadening your view to the world. You're expressing yourself outward. And so these houses have, the ninth house in particular, has that great quality of being able to do that. Also, the ninth house is responsible for prayer, as I mentioned, prayer and prayers, preaching, preachers, representatives of foreign countries. So this would be diplomats, ambassadors, anybody who's acting in that role, trying to solve a diplomatic problem, like I said, negotiators or peace negotiators, people who travel for that, even traveling salesmen obviously would be in this case. It's going to be take a wide range of ideas, but the basic idea there is that you're talking about expansion. If you have to have one word you want to hang on to, it's expansion. So the ninth house is about expansion, travel, and education. I'm going to go back and review. Eighth house is about sex and death, but it's more about regeneration, outside money, and wealth, especially outside money, like I said, venture capital. The seventh house is about relationship. This is a very critical piece for you because relationships are everything. You are in a relationship with everything. Everybody you know in your life, you are in a relationship with. And those relationships vary. Some relationships are very good, as you well know. Some are very bad, and some just don't work and never will work. But it's nice to know why they do work or don't work. That is what you can find out from a professional astrology reading. When I get your birth information, if you so choose to do that, I will have your birth date, your birthplace, your birth time. I'll be able to determine the ascendant right here, which is where that lands in the chart of this person, which then sets the orientation for this whole wheel. This whole wheel can turn. If it was a different person, it would turn. There's one part of the segment where I go back and I show the opposite. Instead of being 4:31 p.m., it's 4:31 a.m. And what happens, everything that's in the seventh house over there is over here now, and that's over there. So the relationship actually changes. But relationship is a reflection of us as individuals. We spend our time relating, and every relationship is different. So if I had to pick one of these three houses that we discussed today as the most important, I would say the seventh house by far. Matter of fact, I would say 90% of the people who come to see me for a professional astrology reading are there to understand two things. Where's the money and where's my love of my life? Those are the two things they want. Or where's my job? Job is the same thing as money, but they want to know where the money's coming from. They want to know where the job's coming from. If you want to understand how astrology works, the best thing to do is get your own personal chart, which you can get from my website, turningthewheel.com or chrisflisher.com. I also do a podcast called Turning the Wheel, which you can get on iTunes as well and any other place. And I discuss these topics with other astrologers and helps me bring about an educational quality to it. Ninth house, education and travel. Eighth house, sex and death. I know it sounds juicy, and the seventh house, house of relationships. We are in a relationship with everything and everybody in our lives. Whether we want it to be or not, we are in a relationship. So the best answer for you, the best idea for you is, if you want to understand this further, is to contact me. I can sit down and walk you through it, and you'll find out how rich and how accurate astrology is. And until then, I'll talk to you all the next episode where we do 10, 11, 12.